Now, I don't know if you've ever taken an epic journey, a journey where you set out for a destination you really want to reach, but the length and the challenge of the journey to get there leaves you questioning more than once, are we there yet? You know, in our years as missionaries in Malawi, Sarah and I certainly went on a few epic journeys in our time. And one of those journeys was in 2018 when we were leading a discipleship training school. And as part of the training, we sent a team of young missionaries to Zimbabwe. And they were ministering, reaching out to the people there. And we went on this journey to go and visit the team, to support them and encourage them. But the journey to get there was pretty epic. We drove our car from southern Malawi, where we were living, through Mozambique, across the border into Zimbabwe, and then all of the way to the remote village where they were living and ministering at the time. And on the way, we had to navigate corrupt police officials. We didn't have to corrupt them. That wouldn't be good. Don't do that. We had to navigate corrupt police officials, 2 international borders, some fairly interesting drivers on the road, several different languages, 4 different currencies, and 750 kilometres of road of varying quality. We even narrowly avoided having our vehicle hijacked when we were in Harare, in the capital of Zimbabwe. And on top of all of this, Sarah was pregnant with our first child at the time. Not an easy journey. And more than once we found ourselves questioning, are we there yet? But after having this amazing time visiting and encouraging the team in northeastern Zimbabwe, for some reason, we decided it would be a good idea to make our journey even more epic by extending our time in Zimbabwe and travelling on to visit Victoria Falls. And so this meant driving on for a further 1,000 kilometres to visit Victoria Falls. And, you know, seeing the biggest waterfall on earth had always been a dream of mine, and we thought, well, we're in the right country, we're on the right continent. And, you know, but to be honest, the journey to get there was pretty epic, and I think it was mainly my wife at the time who was questioning a few times, are we there yet, Tom? But I can honestly say that as long and as tough and as tiring as the journey was to get there, our end destination made it all worth it. You know, seeing this incredible natural wonder of the world, millions of litres of water. I think we got the picture, yeah. Millions of litres of water pouring over the cliff edge, the incredible scenery, the wildlife, and as well as all these physical things, this was a real time where God met with me, and I felt him speaking to me and envisioning me and giving me dreams and hopes for the future. Even though it was a pretty tough journey, and afterwards we had to make the long drive back to Malawi, it turns out that some journeys, however epic, are definitely worth it. And this morning we're taking a brief pause from our current preaching series in the book of Luke. And I want to share a message that I believe is on the Lord's heart for us this morning as a church. Recently I've been reading through the Old Testament book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, we read of this epic journey that God took his people on. This journey of deliverance out of their slavery in Egypt. This journey where God displayed his power through wonders and miracles, where he defeated Pharaoh's army. He led the people through the waters of the Red Sea, guided them through the wilderness, and led them on to Mount Sinai, where they had this life-transforming encounter with God, where God revealed to them his glory. He gave them laws to live by as his people, and he taught them how to worship him and prepared them for the journey on to the land that he had promised to give to them. It was an epic journey. And as followers of Jesus, there are so many lessons we can learn from this book. Because the exodus of the Israelites is a picture for us as Christians of the way God has saved us through Jesus and the journey of faith that he calls us to walk on with him. As we read of the journey the ancient Israelites went on with God, we also learn more of that journey that God is inviting us on to go on with him today. And this morning we pick up their story in Exodus chapter 16. If you've got a Bible, you can turn there with me, but the words will also be on the screen behind me. We read this from Exodus chapter 16, verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. Here we meet the Israelites in the desert, no longer in Egypt, but not yet at Sinai, and seemingly lost out in the wilderness. In this passage, they've just left behind the oasis of Elim, which felt like a place of comfort and refreshment, and now they find themselves in this place where there's very little water, very little food, and the promised land seems a very long way off. And it was a time where many of the people must have been thinking, are we there yet, God? And there can be times in our lives where it feels like God is leading us through the wilderness. Times of waiting, times of unfulfilled promises. No longer in Egypt, but not yet in the promised land. No longer lost and bound by our sin, but not yet living in the fullness of everything that God has promised to do in our lives. And the truth is, being in the wilderness can feel uncomfortable, uncertain, and unfulfilling. It can be a time of questioning and frustration, a time where we find ourselves asking more than once, are we there yet, God? But what we discover in the story of the Israelites is also true for us today. That when God leads us into the wilderness, he remains with us every step of the way. And he does so in order to fulfill his loving purposes in our lives. God is with us in the wilderness. He is working in the waiting. And knowing him and walking into his purposes for our lives makes the challenge and the length of the journey more than worth it. And so this morning I want to unpack from this passage some of the purposes that I believe God has for us as he leads us through the wilderness. Firstly, in the wilderness, God refines our faith. When you hit difficulties, what is your default instinct? For the Israelites, in the barrenness of the desert, their first instinct was not one of looking to God in faith, but of looking back to Egypt. From verse 2, we read this. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat round pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the sixth day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world. It was the most wealthy, powerful, and advanced civilization on earth at that time. And faced with the wilderness, the Israelites began yearning for the security and provision that Egypt could offer them. They seemed to have forgotten that Egypt was also the land of their bondage. And in their hearts, they longed for the food and the comfort that Egypt represented to them. And so often we can be tempted to look to the world to give us security and provision rather than trusting in God to provide us with those things. However, even though they doubted him, God remained faithful to his people in the wilderness. He knew their need for food, and he provided for their needs by sending them manna and quail. Skipping to verse 13. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." In this place of barrenness and lack, God supernaturally provided for his people by giving them the manna and the quail, this wafer-like bread that formed on the ground, and these small birds that came and settled around the camp. God was teaching his people to trust him. And sometimes God will allow us to lack what we need temporarily to teach us about trusting him in the unknown. There was nothing the Israelites could do to make the manna and the quail fall. All they could do was trust that the Lord would send it and receive it from his loving hand. And there's a beautiful picture of God's grace in this for us. God doing for us what we don't deserve and could never earn. And as God sent the people the manna, he gave them clear instructions. In verse 4, he says, the people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. But further on in verse 20, we read this. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Rather than practicing daily dependence on God alone, the people attempted to take control of their own provision, to use their own ability to provide for themselves. They thought, let's stockpile this manna stuff, and then we don't need to worry. If God doesn't send it tomorrow, no worries. We've got more than we need. And in different ways, so often we try to depend on our own ability rather than depending on God's grace. And yet, just as that manna they stored up ended up rotten and full of maggots, often in my experience, when I end up depending on myself, I end up in a bit of a stinking mess. Rather, God wants his people to trust that as they follow and obey him in all things, he will take care of their every need. Jesus taught us to pray, didn't he? Give us today our daily bread. It is about a relationship of daily dependence on him, so that we wouldn't only receive the things we need from him, but grow daily closer to him in love and trust. Not worrying about the future, not trying to control our future, but trusting that God will take care of tomorrow as we remain faithful to him today. When we think about the journey of faith that we are on and God's will for our lives, so often we're concerned about outward questions. Where will I live? What will I do? What will life look like? But God is so deeply concerned about inward questions, about the quality of our hearts. And if there are areas in our hearts where we've been putting our faith in the world or trusting in our own ability, in the wilderness, these things will come to the surface. And God allows these things to come to the surface in the wilderness so that he can deal with them and call us back to trusting in him alone. We're so often in a hurry to arrive in the promised land, and yet we mustn't miss what God has for us in the wilderness, because in the wilderness, God refines our faith. Secondly, in the wilderness, God refocuses us on himself. One of the main responses the Israelites had to being in the wilderness was to moan about their situation. In verse 2, we've already read of how in the desert the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Ancient Israel knew how to grumble. Throughout the Exodus story, we read of how time and time again, when faced with obstacles or issues, the people start complaining. And in the barrenness and uncertainty of the desert, the whole community grumbled against their leaders. They were a nation of grumblers. And the truth is that as the British, we're a little bit of a nation of grumblers as well, aren't we? We know how to complain about anything. We're kind of experts at it. You know, if it's raining, we'll complain it's too wet. If it's sunny, we'll complain it's too hot. If we go to the beach, we'll complain it's too sandy. If we go for a walk, we'll complain it's too muddy. We complain about all the problems in our own country, but if we ever go overseas to another country, we complain it's not like home. We live in a nation of grumblers. And yet in this passage, we see that complaining and grumbling towards others exposes a lack of gratitude towards God. As they grumbled against him in verse 8, Moses said to the people, "Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." The Israelites had so much they could have given thanks to God for. He'd spared them the plagues of Egypt. He delivered them from their slavery. He parted the Red Sea. He destroyed the armies of Pharaoh, leading them each day, every step of the way in their journey, as that cloud by day and that fire by night. And yet at the first sign of difficulty, they start complaining. And we may live in a nation of grumblers, but as God's chosen and dearly loved people, those whom he's rescued from darkness and brought into the kingdom of the Son that he loves, the kingdom of his wonderful light, God has called us to be a people of gratitude. Philippians 4 verse 4 says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. Not only when things are going well, not only when we're in the place of plenty, not only when we're seeing the promises fulfilled, always. Kathy was sharing that word earlier, that God wants us to gift us with his joy. You know, the joy of God, as Pete was sharing, is not a human joy. It's not a joy based on circumstances or what we see before us. It is that divine gift from God. And as we rejoice in the Lord always, we will shine amongst a nation of grumblers. God has called us to be a people who remember and rejoice in all that he has done for us in the past and trust him with the difficulties and uncertainties of what lies before us. To be a people who find in God a reason to rejoice in every situation, in every season of life. Later on in this chapter, we read of one of the instructions God gave to Moses in the wilderness. Verse 32. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law, that it might be preserved. Through Moses, the Lord instructs that some of the manna should be kept safe in a jar. He then instructed that this jar of manna should be put together with the stone tablets which God wrote the 10 Commandments on, and that these would be kept together for future generations to remember of how the Lord had been faithful to his people in the wilderness. Later on in the Exodus story, we read of how the tablets of the covenant law and the manna were then placed together inside the Ark of the Covenant. This gold-plated box which was kept in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, the sacred tent where God's presence came to dwell among his people and where they came to offer their sacrifices of worship to him. And in all of this, we see that when we pass through wilderness seasons of lack and uncertainty, he is wanting to refocus our hearts on himself. To find in every season a reason to rejoice in him. To lift our eyes off of the difficulties before us and upwards towards him who is always worthy of our worship. To stop embracing an attitude of complaining and to lift our eyes to God in love and praise. To remember and rejoice in all that he's done for us already. Trust him with the difficulties and certainties that still lie before us. Not to pretend that our struggles don't exist. Not to pretend like everything is okay when it isn't. But even in the midst of our lack and our need and our uncertainty in the present moment, to offer a sacrifice of praise to our God. Paul wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again, rejoice. Knowing that in every season he is still worthy of our worship. And like the jar of manna that was kept in the Holy of Holies, trusting that the current struggles we see before us will one day become a testimony of his faithfulness to us. That even in the wilderness he was with us and he was faithful to us every step of the way. In the wilderness, God refocuses us on himself. Finally, in the wilderness, God readies us for his promises. I think for many of us, a time which felt a little bit like walking through the wilderness was the COVID period, with all of the government lockdowns and everything that went on in that time. This strange time where life got put on hold in different ways, and we weren't able to do many of the things which usually bring us life or give us a sense of vision and purpose. And for me and Sarah was due to give birth to our second child at the end of 2020. And because of the healthcare situation in Malawi, we decided to fly back to the UK to stay with Sarah's parents in Bristol to prepare for the birth. But because of COVID, we ended up being stuck in the UK for about 7 months, most of which were spent in some kind of lockdown. Having had these years when we've been on all these adventures with God in the nations, traveling around, seeing God at work, sending out teams, doing ministry in different places, seeing his kingdom advancing, now I found myself not able to leave a small area of inner city Bristol. And my days consisted of taking my son to the park and pushing him around the streets on his scooter. Now, don't get me wrong, spending time with my son was a joy, but I also had a massive loss of vision and significance and purpose in this time. And we had no idea how or when we'd be able to get back to Malawi to continue the mission we felt God had called us to do. I definitely felt like I was wandering in the wilderness at this time. And yet God was so present and so faithful in this season. He was teaching us so many lessons about trusting in him, finding our joy in him, depending on him, whatever the situation, that was actually, I believe, preparing us for the next season he had for us in Malawi. And when God did finally make a way for us to go back to Malawi and continue this mission he'd called us to do, we were carrying these lessons with us. In verse 35 of Exodus 16, we read this. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. For 40 years, God led the people through the wilderness, guiding them as the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, and giving them manna to eat until they reached the border of the promised land. But did you know that if they had walked directly in a straight line from Mount Sinai, where he gave them the law, to the border of the promised land, it would have taken them about 11 days. 11 days. And yet God led the people through the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years. Why would God do that? Because God knew that although he was more than able to bring the people into the land, the people were not yet ready to enter it. Although he was perfectly able to take them straight there, their hearts were not ready to deal with the blessings of being in their own land. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, Moses is reminding the Israelites about what God's purposes were for leading them in the wilderness for so long. We read this from Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out in the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. God has wonderful and glorious promises he has spoken over our lives. Ways in which he wants to bless us, make us abundantly fruitful, and use us for his glory. But you see, God knows that as much as the wilderness is a test of our faith, so is the land of promise. As much as times of uncertainty and lack test our love and loyalty to God, so too when we are blessed, when we lack nothing, when we see those dreams he's put in our hearts fulfilled, then all the more do we need to learn to look to God in trust and love, loving him more than the blessings he gives to us. And God knew that if the Israelites could learn to humble themselves and depend on him in the wilderness, this would prepare them to remain humble and dependent on him even when they reached the promised land. When I look back to that wilderness season we spent in Bristol in lockdown, I can see how God was preparing us for what he was taking us into next. I can see how in many ways our time in lockdown was preparing us for this next season in Malawi, how he was refining our faith, providing for what we needed, equipping us in different ways, and dealing with wrong attitudes in our hearts. When we were in it, that season in lockdown felt never-ending. But God had not forgotten his promises to us in our lives, and he was more than able to bring his promises to pass. Sometimes we're in such a hurry to step into God's promises over our lives. We keep asking him, are we there yet, God? Are we there yet, God? But I believe this morning the Lord needs some of us to hear the wilderness will not last forever, but it will last for as long as he knows it needs to. He is faithful and more than able to bring about his promises over our lives, but not before he has done everything in our lives which he needs to do in this current season. Because in the wilderness, God readies us for his promises. I don't know if this is speaking to any of you this morning, but perhaps for some of you, you feel like you're in something of a wilderness in your life right now. Know that it's not going to last forever. And part of why he has taken you into the wilderness is to prepare you for the wonderful promises he has for your lives. Far from meaning that God has forgotten about us or doesn't love us, God takes us through seasons in the wilderness precisely because of his great love for us. He takes us because in his love and wisdom, he knows that the wilderness is a place of transformation. It's a place where he will refine our faith, refocus us on himself, and ready us for his promises. God's promises and plans are not only for us as individuals, but also for us together as his people. And as a church, you know, God has wonderful and amazing promises he's spoken over us. He's preparing to work among us in ways that are beyond anything we could ask or imagine. He's preparing to pour out his Spirit in greater measure. He's preparing to take us deeper in love and faith in him. He's preparing for a great harvest of souls he wants to bring in through us. And yet, as we wait for him to move, he is at work in this time in really important ways. We often sing that song and the words say, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You never stop working. You never stop. You never stop working. He's with us in the waiting, and he is at work in the wilderness within us. Why don't we pray? God, I want to thank you for your love and faithfulness to us. And Lord, I thank you that in every season of our lives, you never stop working. Lord, perhaps some of us today feel like we're way out lost in the wilderness. Others of us, we're walking in your promises and life is good and the sun is shining. Others of us, there's a sense in which we're just about to take that step into your promised land. I don't know where each of us are today, but in every season, you are faithful and at your work. And God, I pray for us in every season, we wouldn't resist your work, but we would open ourselves up for you to do all that you will to do in this time of our lives. Putting our trust in you, looking to you, and walking in step with you. As I was praying about this morning, I saw this picture of an archer putting a bow in an arrow and then kind of tightening and pulling back the string. And I felt like for some of us this morning, there's this sense of increasing tension, increasing frustration, an increasing sense of, God, why are we not moving forwards? If anything, it feels like we're moving backwards. But I believe the Lord is pulling the string tight. And he is preparing you for what he is about to launch you into. Do not resist his work. Lean into it and embrace it. Because this season is critical for you to hit the mark and make the impact that the Lord wants you to make. And Lord, I pray for each one of us this morning. Yeah, we would know what it is for us to walk faithfully with you. And Lord, you would give to each one of us in this season what it is we need right now. Lord, for some of us, it's that gift of joy that we were hearing about earlier. Lord, for some of us, it's the refining of our faith and our trust in you. Lord, for some of us, it's like a daily provision looking to you each day. You know what we need. We trust in you.